Hey quilt makers, if you're at all like me, you're a bit carefree, you have a giant pile of scraps left over from your stash, and you just love to make stuff, but you don't always know what to make. So I have the perfect solution. I have created a random scrap block generator for all of you. We've got wonderful free patterns. I'm going to show you how to work through all of the individual units. Are you ready? Let's get stitching. Well, welcome back everybody to another awesome episode of Sew Well. And yes, kind of the first official tutorial of Scrap Masters. And we have so many things to discuss. But before we dive in, I really want to throw a giant shout out to my new friend, Chris Marchini at the Rose City Originals up in Portland, Oregon. He is the gentleman who came up with this idea that I saw a few years ago, actually, on the interweb, and he makes wonderful community quilts where he rolls a 20-sided or a 20-numbered die to tell you which pages, and he does all of it with the AccuQuilt system. Really cool. So I was inspired by this. I met Chris recently. We compared some notes and ideas. He's blessed my Scrap Masters idea, and I really am excited to share this with all of you. So if you hadn't heard, I have some leftovers, and you might also, and we don't call them or they're a stash until they go into the project, but they are kind of scraps. And I did spend quite a while, actually more time than I wanted to, organizing my scraps. And mostly what I'm working from in this project series is going to be 5 to 6 inch squares, 3.5 to 2.5 inch squares. And then I've got some strips that we'll trim down as we need, but I want to work through things that I had made and or set aside from before. And we're going to get some crazy blocks. This one isn't even in the series, but this was just something I was using up some of my leftover or my Maverick blocks that were left behind. This was from a New Year's Day sew along a couple years ago. This one is basically like the New Year's Day sew along block from a couple years ago, but the colors are all wonky now and out of order. A fun chain block. And then of course, this one here we'll talk about in a little bit. This is a 3-color block. It is made all out of scrap fabric. And then I've got a bunch more up on the wall, and I've gotten a little bit of a head start in front of you so that I could test my theory on the wonderful free pattern that you can get right now in the description below. Please share the link with your friends so they can also download it themselves. And what it really is, folks, is I've taken a bunch of these blocks, 6 of them as a matter of fact, and I've broken them down into individual units. So yes, you get 6 free blocks that you're welcome to do anything. They don't have to be scrappy. And real quick before I go too far, I want to point out there's some pink lines that might be hard to see with our overhead cameras and things. However, those are going to help us break them down into more units later after I just tell you how the whole fun works each week, right? Okay, so anyways, all the way up to 6 blocks. And then each block is consisting of units A through I, and I've got some fun notes, and I'm going to walk you through how to make all of these different units today, and they really are simple squares or rectangles and or half square triangles. All of the different units can be built and used in the blocks as we go. I'm going to fire up the iron as we get ready to talk about how would you know what we're doing. So each Friday I do a live video right here on YouTube. It's a great way for our community to get involved, share stories, and engage with everybody and whatnot. But I thought it would be really great if we could come up with this random scrap block generator. So what we first do is we take a die with 6 numbers on it and we roll that die, number 3, and then we would come over here and we would pick, lucky grab actually, block 3, which was actually last week's, depending on when you're actually watching this, but it was when I made this really fun project. This was block number 3, okay? Then the next thing we're going to want is we want some guidance for our colorways. Now you can see on the wall that my blocks are all multicolors, but each one of them kind of has a theme color, and it will help us make more sense, and it helps me stay on track when I don't know what to sew. There's too many variables, so I need just a few guidelines or a random scrap block generator. So then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to spin our color wheel, folks. And with that color wheel spinning, it's going to land, and If this was our block for the day, we would now have a yellow-orange family. And if you're watching the live videos, I will take some time with another color wheel because I'm learning color theory myself, quilt makers. And so we're going to talk about the ways we could use our yellow-orange and pull in other colors that make some really dreamy scrap blocks, right? So the second thing we do, we've rolled, we know what block we're on for the week. We have spun, so we know which color we're on for the week. And then what we do is we have this 20-sided die, and we take this and we roll this, and we're really hoping for a high number. High number, high number, high number. Hey, 18. We're doing great today, folks, right? So with 18, what that would mean is you get to use as many as 18 different fabrics in your block. So this is what I wanted to show you earlier. This block here, folks, would be the example of something that had more like 18 different fabrics in it. Now, probably not a complete 18. And you can see as you look, not even all the squares are the same. And it actually doesn't even really follow the same formula. Here's how the block's really supposed to look. Look at the edges going out there, right? And this would be the exact same block, folks, but with a number 3 on our last roll, meaning that you're limited to only 3 fabrics. So as I was pointing out, on the last week when we started doing this on our social media, I was limited to only 4 fabrics, which made it quite quick to construct, but also makes it a little less scrappy looking in the end. So I'm always hoping for a high roll, but because it's a random scrap block generator, it's random, and that's what we're getting. Okay, so all of the explanations have been put out now. Let me go ahead and just slide these out of the way as we get ready to start building into our individual units. There is one more thing, and I'm sorry folks, I hate to point this out, but we have one rule involved in Scrap Masters. And as you look closely on the pattern, the only rule, there are no rules. And then again, there's the link for the YouTube channel where we get to put all this fun and have together. But anyway, so when I'm saying there's no rules, even last time I rolled and I got a 4 and I was limited to only 4 fabrics. Well, of course I could have changed that to 14 in my brain if I wanted to. This is all just for fun. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna make a bunch of blocks, 1 a week probably, and we're going to keep posting them on our wonderful Facebook private group, the So Well Rob Appell private group. And then in a few months, we're going to have a bunch of blocks that we can build together into awesome quilts. So hopefully that all makes sense. Let's dive right in now, where I'm just going to walk you through each and every block construction. And so starting with our A block, as you can see, it would normally be a 4.5 inch square. So folks, yes, you could of course use 1 square, and you're going to want to trim them down to 4.5 inches. So I like to use a 4.5 marker here, finding a straight line and a straight line. And then I would trim this block down. Okay. And that technically is how you make the A square. It's a 4.5 by 4.5. But remember those high number rolls. Maybe what we really wanted was we had like an 18 or a 19 or a 20. So now we want to say green in the center of a block, but maybe we don't want to have it be all the same. So these are 2.5 inch squares. Let me confirm. These are 2.5 inch squares because they were scraps. They were left over from before. And so now I'm just going to kind of pick a random series here. Let's do this. Now as I sew these together, so 2.5 and 2.5 if you're brand new to quilting, once we use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Of course, if you were brand new to quilting, you probably wouldn't have a giant scrap pile, but nonetheless, what we're going to do now is if we sew our 2.5s together, and our 2.5s together, those will technically form a 4.5 by 2.5 inch rectangle. We won't need block 3 today. That was just showing you how that would be generated. So even in something like this, let's practice our good quilting habits, and we're going to always press to our darker of our 2 fabrics. And that way, I can rotate nest them together and have a fun little block. So again, I'm going to sew this in, 1/4 inch seam allowance, nesting my seams, making sure my bottom corners are as nice as my top corners were. And now we technically have a 4.5 by 4.5 inch square also that would all be from the same color fabrics or close enough. That would be my A square. Now folks, I don't want to bum you out too much, but I actually just did also show you how you would develop the B square. However, there are some of our blocks, like I was referring to earlier, where these are using the B squares and these are utilizing your A squares. So you could see why the color differences. I tried to show a mostly green colorway, green example here, but as you get into the B squares on your diagram, please note that you are going to only use 4 2.5 inch squares, and you're primarily using opposite colors so that when you get into a block like block number 2, you have your solid A squares, you have a light dark combo, a light medium combo, and a dark medium combo in making all of the squares that you could put together. Now, please note, if you had a 20 or an 18 again, we might want to make these A squares of all the same color family, but just make them a little closer so they don't read like the rest of the chain block. Hoping that makes sense. Okay, so basically I've showed you the A and the B. Let's dive into the C squares, or C units, I should probably call them. Okay, so now I'm just going to go ahead and take that 4.5 inch square I had, right? And now I would use another 2.5 inch square. Let's confirm. Perfect. Now for these, you can do one of two things. You can make a diagonal line by laying a ruler just slightly inside of the tips. Draw yourself a little diagonal line. And now take and lay your fabrics right sides together so that diagonal line goes from one edge across. And you can come in here, move your edge guide out of the way, or if you're using an edge guide foot, you probably don't want it on there. And you can stitch through right on that line. Or if you're using any of the seam tape, you'll notice that that diagonal is also pointing right at that red line. So most of my scrap master blocks, because they're made from scraps, are also made pretty quickly. Shouldn't say that too loud. Okay, so now for a C block, what we would want to do is go ahead and just trim this off carefully. Probably should have used a ruler there to protect my hand. And then I would go ahead and press this upward. However, folks, if you look closely at the C block, it could be made with, yes, a 2.5 inch half square triangle, a 2.5 inch square, and then a 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch rectangle, or 3 2.5 inch squares and a 2.5 inch square, or it could have been made just like I showed you. Hoping that makes sense a little bit, but technically if you think about it, right, we could have 1 and 2 and 3 of those squares there, okay? And then we could have also used, I'm just going to use this because it will help me, that half square triangle, and you can now see how that also would represent that same block, okay? So again, each unit finishes with the 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch so that all of the blocks finish at 12.5 inch by 12.5 inch. But remember, your subunit cuts are always going to be 2.5s, whether the half square triangles or if that would have been a rectangle, 2.5 by 4.5 because of the finished length of the block. Okay, so, and if you'll notice, as we start to build through the individual units, okay, I keep adding a part on for you. So now, I didn't realize how easy this demo was going to get, right? if this was the beginning of unit D, a 4.5-inch square with 2 triangles or 2 snowballed corners, right? I could have put this on to avoid that selvage there and sew diagonally across here, which I'm about to do using my seam tape. The key to making this D unit though is you always sew on one of the triangles if you're using the full 4.5-inch square to begin with. Do as we did originally, trim it, press it, and then sew on the second as we're doing now, so that you get the overlap of the corners. And folks, if you're going through your stash, I don't know that I have any of them, but I probably could have made one for today's video. Think about it. This unit here across there could have been a flying geese unit that was left over from another project. So you could have taken a flying geese unit that was 4.5 by 2.5 and stitched it to a 4.5 by 2.5 rectangle. You would have a seam across here. So there's a lot of different ways to make each and every individual unit. Now, you can see this coming off the iron. It's a bit wonky. So again, I'm gonna find my really good 4.5, 4.5, and I'm gonna also take the time, oops, I said that wrong. Almost trimmed it down. Yep, so I'm just gonna have to trim off the edges now here to square that up, bring that around so it's nice and safe. And then that outside edge there to square that up as well. Okay, now I mentioned the use of a flying geese unit, 2 half square triangles on the rectangle, so to speak. But once we get into unit E, now I mentioned a few moments ago the use of what would be kind of a flying geese and a rectangle or 2 squares down here. When we get into unit E, as we see here, I think it is in block number 6, we see unit E start to pop up. This is a really cool block here, folks. And why that becomes important is here you see the flying geese units connected to the rectangle units. They could have also been connected to 2 squares if you need, but there becomes a lot more patchwork in this block than there may have been in this block to begin with. So you might not need to sub out so many of the units because you already have a lot of seams happening in here. But this is block number 6. And as we get into the unit E, yes, you're definitely going to want to watch that color combo, or you might find it's easiest to go to your piles. And remember, we had some strips, we had some scraps and everything. So let's see, maybe this is the right size. This is fun kind of making today's video obviously a bit disorganized. So if it's 4.5, I can use it. Wonderful. And I don't know that I'm going to be able to get a real good cut. There's 4.5 by 2.5 right there. I've got a straight edge and a straight edge. So to make the flying geese unit first, yes, I'm going to trim off to take this rectangle down to the 4.5 by 2.5. Now, like earlier, I'm going to take and match on first. And you could have drawn your diagonal line across there. Or if you are using the seam tape, of course, you could just use your seam tape. Sometimes I'll do both. So now that I have that line on there, but like before, I always want to sew on one of the new pieces or the triangle to be first, so that after I've stitched it on, I can come over here, trim off that excess down to that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to press away from the rectangle. Okay, now, and folks, before we go any further, we are trying to omit our scraps. So these parts down here, I have a pillowcase that I keep, and that is for the dog beds. Once they get down to that small, I'm not going to use them anymore. However, my crazy friend Tiffany Hayes will be using those, and she's making half-size blocks because she's twice as smart. Anyways, I'm going to stitch across here. She also loves batiks. Batiks are nice and stable. And she has that size scrap bin laying about because she's got so many of those small pieces leftovers. I have been really working for the longer time on the bigger, easier blocks, so I have bigger, easier scraps to work with now, and I'm choosing not to save them. Okay, so I put on the 2.5 inch square on top of the 4.5 inch by 2.5 inch rectangle. We're going to press this over now. Okay, but in the honoring of our unit E, we now want an opposing color to fit in here. So let's take something like this and trim this down. Oh, this is so fun. Oh, wait, is that one closer to the right size already? Nope. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch ready. Here. So this piece back up into the scrap pile. This piece here into the dog bed it goes. These two pieces will marry together. Now I'm using the black line as my seam allowance line because that's where I set that edge guide to anyways. Love working with solids because there is no wrong side. And now I can press this out. And this here will make our wonderful unit E. Okay? Should be fairly simple. Those are some larger pieces. Now as we move into F and G, we are getting into more and more smaller pieces, or maybe I should just say more of our little squares and more of our half square triangles. So I happen to have a couple of half square triangles that have already been made. These are going to measure at 2.5. And folks, I apologize. I got going so quickly today because I was so excited. I forgot to point out that your very first diagram talks about how to make the 2 at a time half square triangles using a 3-inch cut, the drawn line as I've been showing you, then trimming them back down to the 2.5s. That's what most of us teach and a lot of us have in our stash. I apologize, but that's your cutting info right at the beginning before even block A or unit A starts. So now that we're back here to unit F, I have these made and they are trimmed down, okay? And so because these are trimmed down, but I'm seeing that I want to have a different color pattern. You see these are 3-toned here. So I'm just going to grab these purple ones out of my stash so that I can match them up to a couple of these fun light green ones. Now the light green ones, also being 2.5 inch squares, yes. Following our diagram, you're going to have one in the upper left, one in the lower right corner. And then basically, if you follow the diagram, I'm just putting my darker triangles to the outsides of that unit as we go. I'm going to go ahead and stitch together 2 by 2. And because I'm there, I do want to go ahead and rotate in that seam allowance guide because this will help for a lot of these. And now I'm going to sew those 2 straight edges. And I do a lot of chain piecing when possible. So a lot of times I'll have all of the little micro units out on the table as I'm getting started, so I know which ones to stitch to which ones. And it's fun that way because the scrappier they are, the more you want to randomize your colors. So a little pre-design on your table or your wall has also been very effective for me. I'm going to go ahead and just press towards the flat square versus the patchwork half square triangle. And then as I go ahead to join these blocks again, making sure my darks are on the outside, relatively speaking, of course, I'm going to go ahead and grab these seams. Did a terrible job pressing them, but that's okay because they're still going to nest nice at the machine. Just got to get a little forceful with them. or not. Lost that round, didn't I? Okay, so again, that's just going to press open. So our unit F is really, it's the only way to make it utilizing the squares and the half square triangle so that you get the 3 color combos in that little square. Okay. Now, when it comes to unit G, of course, we could have started again with another one of our 4.5 inch squares. So let's just trim that down. 4.5, 4.5 there. And let's find ourselves a stack of opposing color 2.5 inch squares somewhere up in here. I've been getting pretty low on them. Oh, this will be fun. 1, 2. I don't really have any black up there. Maybe I don't want to do black. Well, again, there's no rules. So here we go. We're going to use these ones. So if I'm doing unit G, I'm going to show you how to sew it as the square with 4 other squares onto it. Hopefully you can see, obviously that could be assembled with 4 half square triangles, but you would want your half square triangles all made so that they match when they come together. This is the fun about Scrappy, right? I guess they don't have to completely match. Wouldn't that be an awesome looking block? Kind of looks like a Pac-Man, doesn't it? At any rate, oh, my brain just went through 1,000 different fun jokes I could have said. All right, I better stop now while I'm ahead. So for these are all my 2.5 inch squares. And again, I can have diagonals or my seam tape, but the key to this is I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna sew my colors I want onto opposite corners of the big square first. Oh, look at that. I even have a chalk line. You may not be able to see it, but I can. So being that there is a chalk line pre-drawn, of course I'm gonna use it. That's the fun part about working with our scraps. So to make life super easy, I'm going to sew over the one first. This was kind of my matching color. And on the opposite side of the square, I'm going to now sew on the other side. So that like with our flying geese earlier, we can trim and press before we add on the overlapping squares. Okay, so again, probably should use a rotary cutter to keep my hand safe. I mean, a template or ruler to keep my hand safe. These are for the dog bed. And now as I come over to the iron, I'm going to press away from the big square into the what were small squares. Now they are called cornerstones or snowballs or part of the block. And that's where we're at. But because they're pressed over, it makes life super easy as I put on the last 2 squares, edge to edge. And then, like before, once the opposite sides have been stitched on, trim them off in a safe fashion. Set them aside for your dog beds later. And then also press them out away from that big square. So now you've basically made a square in a square unit here for your unit G. Now normally a lot of those G blocks, you do want to have the similar colors on. Here's a good example. However, it won't kill you to have them be wonky and awkward like this either color-wise, because it is a scrappy project and not every block is going to have the perfect colorways for you to work with. That's where we're freeing ourselves up and we're realizing in the big beautiful process of the quilt, all of these little extra colors that we didn't expect to use are going to be what we all love looking at so much down the road. So anyways, don't panic if you have 3 awesome ones and one that's not quite what you think you should use. I'm going to encourage you to use it anyways, right? We have a fun, long journey ahead of us, and it really isn't about the destination for this project. It really is about the process of making, or the journey we're on while making each unit for each scrap block. So even though G is probably most simply made as the big square with the snowballed corners, again, it could be done as 4 matching or slightly not matching half square triangles at 2.5 inches. When we get into H, we really want to use at least 3 colors or 3 tones for that. So it's going to require kind of a light and dark and a light and medium series of your half square triangles at 2.5 inches. Or if you look at it real closely, again, it could be a flying goose 4.5 by 2.5, keeping that kind of center color the same. So what we're going to do here, if we want to really mark that out, I've made similar blocks here as I go through. So now technically we can use these 2, and what they would do is they would sew together so they have this really nice point, kind of representing this light side here. And then as these 2 come together, they would also have that really nice point. Now, technically, looking at the diagram, I guess this is darker, so it should be on top. But this is the way you would form it out with the 4 half square triangles, stitched together 2 by 2, and then across the center to make it all work nicely. I unit gets a teeny bit more complicated because what you really need are 2 that are the same and then kind of 2, and I've made them somewhere here that I'm calling opposite. So notice this fabric is this fabric here with these 2. And now this fabric is the other fabric, but it features this. I know it's getting complicated, but when you marry together, and we'll do it like the block in a way, so we've kind of got this lighter stripe running through. Then we're going to have this piece and this piece so that that light series of the half square triangles are touching. And then this fabric comes in here. And yes, this is the dark green. And I'm hoping you can see in the camera with all the lights and everything that these are the medium greens. That's the light, that's the dark. And that's how you get this really cool stripe forming block. And that stripe forming block there, I believe, is our scrap block number 5. Here, as I was showing you earlier. So this, yes, can be done very systematically with just the 3 fabrics, very easy and nice. However, the more you play with it and the more of those half square triangles, and yes, maybe that's why I'm not sewing these together now so I can have them for the real roll the next time on my Scrap Masters, as you can see, again, same exact block we were talking about, and all of those pieces kind of playing and coming together as they work. So those were some of these blocks here we were just building. So a little easier to see here with the true 3 color. In this square, it's really fun looking, but a little harder to see the actual patchwork. And that's what scrap quilting is kind of like. Okay, so that was our almost last block. Now we get into our J block, and our J block, folks, is probably one of the easier blocks. It's something we've all been used to before. You're going to want 4 identical two fabric half square triangles, all at 2.5 inches square. There is no square option for this, really. No pinwheel, no flying goose option for this either, because we're really going to now make our pinwheels. Okay, so I'm going to put light to dark, light to dark, and light to dark as they go around. And again, as I go to the machine, I will match these units together, sew them with that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Do the same to the other side. Sometimes it's easier starting on that flat side up there. And for these, I'm just going to press to the darker of the 2 half square triangles because I'm going to be able to use that to nest here in a moment. So as I hold them in the air, I'm just going to the darker of the 2 that are touching. And we just want to make sure that when we bring them back together, we bring them back together with the skinny points. So I'm going to fold the tips together. It gets a little bulky there. That's why that nesting is so important. And I'm going to go ahead and finish out today's video with this last seam here. Now, some of you might want to spin and twist that center seam. You're more than welcome to. We all have our own ways of quilting and we all have our own stashes. That's why I thought it would be so fun to develop a program that would allow us all to sew together, but using our own things, following our own philosophies on stitching and color theory. Like I said, there's that wonderful pinwheel block. Okay, so that's how you do all of our units, regardless of which units we're making. Folks, remember, they should all be finishing up at the 4.5 inches. We should probably call that raw now, because as we go back to our pattern pages, please note at the bottom of every page, it's going to tell you, some of them use 3 and some of them use 4 different units. It's going to tell you I unit make 4, D unit make 4, J unit make 1, and then it breaks them all down for you basically into the 9-patch sewing method as you go. So hopefully that will make sense, and please make sure that you post your finished photos on the Sew Well Rob Appell Facebook group. I'll make a link here for you at the bottom in our description. Again, your free pattern with all the 6 blocks and all of the information on how to make all of the individual units. Don't forget, the one rule is there is no rule, and please join me on the live show every Friday afternoon, 2 p.m. Pacific time, so that you can see what our newest scrap block generator will offer for us for the week. I encourage you to stitch along and, like I said, put the photos up before the end of the following Friday. Maybe you'll see your block make it on our show and tell. Super fun, super excited. I'm having a blast, and it was wonderful to have you join me today. Thank you, folks, for being here. Make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, and we will see you very soon. Until then, please stay well. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. It really helps support our channel. If you haven't subscribed, do so now. Hit the little button to be notified every time we go live or do a new video for all of you. And here's one from the past I think you'll really enjoy.